About 15 years back, I was nearing the end of a contract job located across the state. During that period, my girlfriend of 3 years, Melissa, had been behaving oddly even before I left. I'd been away for a few weeks, not an extended absence by any means, but just long enough to start questioning the direction of my life, especially our relationship. Things between us had been deteriorating rapidly, and while I hadn't made any official moves, I had pretty much decided to end things with her once I got back home. I figured a face-to-face conversation would be more respectful, despite how unpleasant it might get. The very next day, after I returned, Melissa wasted no time in reaching out. She was already flooding my phone with messages, text after text, call after call. She insisted we meet immediately, claiming she had huge news to share. Her urgency wasn't subtle, and I could tell something serious or dramatic was coming. I agreed to meet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she was about to tell me wasn't going to sit right. When I arrived at her place, she opened the door wearing a wide smile that felt almost too rehearsed, too exaggerated. Her enthusiasm was cranked up to 11, and everything about her demeanor screamed artificial. It didn't feel like joy, it felt like performance. That was when my instincts kicked in hard, warning me that something was very off. Then she hit me with it. She was pregnant. I'll never forget the way those words landed. It felt like I had been punched in the chest. Time froze. I just stood there, trying to process what she had just said. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't speak. My brain needed time to catch up to the reality she was trying to lay at my feet. After the initial shock wore off, the logical part of my brain took over. I asked her the obvious follow-up question. How far along was she? I expected her to say something like 2 weeks, something that would line up with when I had last been home. But instead, she said she was between 4 to 7 weeks pregnant. That immediately set off alarm bells. I started doing the math silently. I had been out of town for at least 5 weeks, possibly closer to 6 depending on the exact calendar count. No matter how I tried to bend the numbers, they just didn't match up. Something wasn't right. Still, I played it cool. I asked her gently if she was certain about the timeline. I thought maybe she'd realize the discrepancy and adjust her story, maybe say she made a mistake. But she didn't. She doubled down. She looked me in the eye and assured me she was absolutely certain about the dates. So I told her straight up, Melissa, I've been gone nearly 6 weeks. That math doesn't check out. The moment those words left my mouth, her expression changed. She went from bubbly to defensive in a heartbeat. Are you doubting me? She shot back with sharp disbelief. Then, in a dramatic tone, she declared, this is our baby. Right then, I understood what was happening. She wasn't interested in the truth, she wanted control. She was determined to bind me to this child no matter the facts. I wasn't about to let that happen. I stayed calm and told her clearly, if she wanted me to be involved in any way, we needed to establish the facts first. That meant a paternity test, and if that came back positive, we'd involve lawyers to determine custody and child's. It was the responsible, logical approach. But Melissa didn't see it that way. She snapped. Her defensiveness turned into outright rage. She accused me of insulting her, of betraying her trust. I can't believe you'd even ask me for that, she shouted, tears welling up in her eyes, not of sadness but of fury. She took my request for a paternity test as a personal attack, equating it to me calling her a liar and a cheater outright. I stood firm, as if a breakup was something she could veto. She genuinely acted as if I had no say in the matter, and continued behaving like we were still together. It was surreal. I left her place confused, hoping that some time apart would bring her back to reality, but I couldn't have been more wrong. In the weeks that followed, my life turned into chaos. Melissa launched a full-blown smear campaign against me. She told everyone she knew, and even people I barely remembered, that I had abandoned her during her pregnancy. Suddenly, I was fielding calls from friends and acquaintances telling me I needed to step up and take responsibility. They believed her story, hook, line, and sinker. She portrayed herself as the heartbroken mother-to-be, left alone by a cruel man. Some of our friends, genuinely thinking they were helping, even started giving her money. Others messaged me in anger or disappointment, shaming me for supposedly walking away. It was like I had become the villain in a story I didn't even recognize. She took to social media, posting vague but emotional updates that painted her as the victim of a cold-hearted betrayal. Every post was a fishing net, and people were biting. The comments filled with sympathy and outrage, none of it directed at her. I tried telling people the truth, but no one was interested. Her narrative was just too compelling, too emotionally charged. Facts didn't stand a chance. Even my own family wasn't immune. They started to ask questions, some of them subtly, others more directly. It was clear that doubts were creeping in, and that's when I knew I needed legal protection. I spoke to a lawyer, and he laid it out plainly. Don't give her any money. Don't communicate anything that could be seen as acceptance of paternity, and document everything. I had briefly considered sending her some financial support just in case the baby turned out to be mine, but my attorney explained that even a small gesture, a single payment, could be used against me in court. It would look like an admission of responsibility. From that moment on, I realized I was walking a legal tightrope. One wrong step could bind me to a child that wasn't mine for the rest. The situation was a nightmare with no clear exit. I was painted as the villain in a story I hadn't written, fighting a battle against lies that people wanted to believe, and no matter what I did, it felt like I couldn't win. Everywhere I turned, I was met with judgmental eyes and accusatory tones. I was the monster in Melissa's story, cold, uncaring, and cowardly. The emotional toll was immense. I started to withdraw from social interactions, avoiding events and gatherings where I might be ambushed by someone demanding an explanation or scolding me for behavior I hadn't even committed. At work, I was distracted. My focus slipped constantly, and my productivity took a hit. It was hard to concentrate when I knew that somewhere out there, people were whispering about me, making assumptions based on lies. My reputation, carefully built over years, was being chipped away piece by piece. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long it would take for the truth to come out, if it ever would. I wasn't just fighting for clarity, I was fighting for my dignity, my sanity, and my future. There's a certain kind of helplessness that sets in when you know the truth, but no one around you believes it or even wants to. Despite the overwhelming pressure, I held the line. I didn't retaliate, I didn't feed the drama. I focused on documenting everything, every conversation, every message, every rumor. I was building my defense brick by brick because I had a strong suspicion that this ordeal wasn't going to end with just a social media smear campaign. Deep down, I feared that one day, I'd be summoned to court, dragged into a legal battle over a child that might not even be mine, and if that day came, I wanted to be ready. Even as I struggled to keep my distance from Melissa and the chaos she brought with her, she always seemed to find people ready to take her side. One of the most persistent was a guy named Tony. He constantly nagged me, insisting I do the right thing and support Melissa like some noble act of redemption. He had this misguided notion that helping her financially or emotionally wouldn't backfire on me. I finally reached my limit and told him point blank, "Tony, if you feel that strongly about it, why don't you support her?" That shut him up, but the conversation stuck with me. It left a sour taste in my mouth. It showed me that some people I'd trusted were all too ready to swallow her story whole while side-eyeing me like I was the villain. That conversation with Tony lingered, leaving a bitter taste that didn't wash out easily. It was disheartening, frustrating beyond words to realize that people I once considered friends were more willing to believe a polished lie than take the time to hear the messy truth. The worst moments, though, were the unexpected public encounters. I'd be running errands or grabbing dinner with friends when I'd catch someone giving me a pointed look, like they already knew my whole story and had judged me without even bothering to ask my side. It didn't matter how I tried to explain. Every time I mentioned that there was no definitive proof I was Lucy's father, I'd get the same reaction: narrowed eyes, judgmental stares, or that subtle shake of the head like I was in denial. Melissa had carefully constructed a narrative in which she was the abandoned, struggling mother, and I was the callous man who had left her behind. And that story was sticky. It clung to people's emotions and refused to let go. Right in the thick of all this, Melissa began sending me photos. Not just any photos. Deliberately staged pictures of her holding Lucy, both of them smiling or sharing tender mother-daughter moments. The captions were even worse. "Lucy wants to know where her daddy is," she'd write. It was clear these messages were crafted to manipulate me, to induce guilt and draw me back in. I'd delete them without responding, hoping she'd eventually lose interest. But deep down, I was starting to see the reality. She had no intention of stopping. In hindsight, I was naive. I thought if I just stayed quiet and distant, she'd eventually move on and let me be. But that was never part of Melissa's plan. She wasn't interested in closure. She wanted control. Every couple of months, like clockwork, she'd find a new way to insert herself into my life again. It would start with innocent-seeming texts. "Lucy's doing great," or "She smiled for the first time today." But then they'd take a turn. "She misses you," or "Too bad you're missing all these special moments." It was always an attempt to pull at my emotions and break down my resolve. At first, I tried to ignore it. I'd tell myself she'd get tired, find a new target, or lose interest altogether. But Melissa wasn't wired that way. If anything, my silence seemed to embolden her. And then, things escalated. She stopped hiding behind messages and started showing up in person. I'd be out with friends, enjoying what was supposed to be a relaxing night, and suddenly she'd appear, baby, in arms, acting like everything was normal. "Oh hey," she'd say brightly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Thought you'd want to see your daughter." The looks I got in those moments were unbearable. People who'd already heard Melissa's side would stare at me like I was the villain in some tragedy. She'd act confused, even hurt, like she couldn't understand why I wasn't thrilled to see her and Lucy. I'd make some excuse to leave or offer a curt response to shut it down, but it was exhausting. Melissa had no shame. Her only goal was to make me feel like the worst person alive. After a few of these surprise encounters, I'd had enough. I went back to my lawyer and laid everything out. Her constant messages, her public confrontations, her insistence on telling anyone who'd listened that Lucy was mine. He recommended filing for a restraining order. It was a long shot, he warned me, but it might give me some breathing room. So we filed. Eventually, I was granted a temporary restraining order. It wasn't perfect. In my state, even a permanent order only lasts 2 years unless there's a violent crime involved. But at the time, even 2 years of peace sounded like a miracle. But 2 years go by faster than you'd think. And on the very day that order expired, Melissa was back like nothing had changed. Messages started pouring in again. She showed up at my apartment building, baby in tow, with a big smile and some story about how Lucy missed her dad or how hard it was being a single mother. She wasn't just trying to reconnect, she was determined to wear me down. So back to court I went. I filed to renew the order, and that became a cycle. Every 2 years, like clockwork, Melissa would reappear the moment the restraining order lapsed. She'd talk about how Lucy deserved a father, how much she was struggling, and how cruel I was being for ignoring them. Sometimes, she'd even try to get inside my home. She'd go on and on about how unhealthy it was for Lucy to grow up without knowing me, and when I refused to open the door, she'd pitch a fit right on my doorstep, for neighbors and passers-by to witness. I could feel the gossip starting to circulate. All I ever wanted was distance, peace, but she was relentless. There was one moment in particular that still haunts me. It was during a formal dinner for work, a chance to unwind, to connect with colleagues in a setting away from deadlines and meetings. I was in the middle of a conversation when Melissa walked in with Lucy, bold as ever. She acted like we were some long-lost family finally reuniting. My boss was there. People from other departments were watching. The room fell into awkward silence. She pulled me aside and launched into her usual speech, how Lucy needed her dad, how I was denying my child a real life. That time, I didn't hold back. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Melissa, get a paternity test, then we'll talk." She didn't respond. She just gave me a wounded look, as if I'd struck her. Then she picked up Lucy and walked out of the restaurant, letting the drama trail behind her like smoke. I was left standing there, my colleagues whispering, my boss shaking his head. Whatever story she had told them before that night, they now had a performance to reinforce it. I wanted to disappear that night. Every bit of effort I'd put into maintaining a professional reputation was at risk, all because she chose that moment to invade my life again. What frustrated me most was that she never once attempted to resolve things the right way. All she had to do was agree to the test. If Lucy was really my daughter, I would have done what was right. But instead, she clung to this twisted version of reality where public pressure could substitute for proof, where perception replaced evidence. That event marked a turning point. I became even more vigilant. I saved every message, screenshot every photo, and kept detailed logs of every encounter. I wasn't going to let her twist the truth anymore. Not in public, not in court, not anywhere. Melissa's tactics may have worked on casual friends or strangers, but I was preparing for the long game. She didn't let up, though. The messages didn't stop. They came in waves. Some pleading, some accusatory, some oddly cheerful as if we were still in some kind of relationship. "Lucy drew a picture of you today," she'd text, attaching a crayon sketch of a stick figure. "She wants to meet her daddy." Other times she'd lash out, calling me heartless, a coward, unfit to be a father. There were moments I almost caved, not because I believed her, but because the weight of it all was crushing. I missed peace. I missed normal. But I knew that one misstep, one emotional slip could cost me dearly. I clung to the facts. No paternity test, no involvement. That was the line I had to hold. And despite the emotional blackmail, the public shame, the endless disruptions to my life, I held that line. Because the truth mattered. And I wasn't going to let a lie rewrite my life. The moment I confronted Melissa at that work dinner, asking her plainly to get a paternity test before any more discussion, she burst into tears on the spot. Right there, in front of my colleagues and my boss, she turned on the waterworks like a faucet. It wasn't subtle. It was dramatic and theatrical. She sobbed and begged, pleading for me to just give Lucy a chance, to be a real father. She made such a scene that people around us stopped eating and turned to watch. It was mortifying, and after that humiliating spectacle, I had to spend weeks doing damage control. Over the next few weeks, I had to do serious damage control at work. I had to sit down with my boss, red-faced, and explain that no, I wasn't secretly the father of a child I was hiding from, and yes, this was part of a long, complicated situation involving an ex who wouldn't let go. It was humiliating. Even though my boss tried to be professional about it, things felt different afterward. There was tension, a shadow hanging over conversations that used to be light. It made showing up for work something I dreaded. Eventually, my lawyer and I agreed that we needed to pursue another restraining order, but this time, we wanted something more durable. He said that while in our state each order could only last 2 years unless physical violence was involved, if we could demonstrate a clear, repetitive pattern, persistent harassment, public disruptions, emotional manipulation, we might convince the court to take a firmer stance. So we documented everything meticulously, every text, every pop-up visit, every third-hand story she fed to mutual friends. We brought it all to court. The judge granted the restraining order, but once again, it came with the usual 2-year expiration. I wasn't surprised. By that point, I had accepted that every 2 years, like clockwork, I'd be facing this same ordeal again. And just as expected, the moment the restraining order lapsed, Melissa was back in my inbox. The pattern was as predictable as it was exhausting. What made it worse was that she didn't limit her campaign to just me. Melissa was relentless in spreading her narrative. I'd hear from old co-workers and mutual friends, people I hadn't talked to in ages, telling me she was still claiming I'd abandoned her and Lucy. She painted me as the stereotypical deadbeat dad, and people just ate it up. Some tried to stay neutral, but others outright suggested I just give in. One even called me up saying maybe you should just do what she wants. I mean, what if Lucy really is yours? That call stuck with me, not because I considered following the advice, but because it summed up the entire ordeal. No one cared about what I had to say. Melissa's story was easier to believe, easier to support. At some point, I gave up trying to defend myself to others. I realized that no matter what evidence I had, people were going to believe what they wanted. The emotional narrative Melissa sold was more appealing than the dry truth of legal standoffs and DNA tests. It didn't matter how logical my arguments were. Emotion trumped reason every time. But dealing with the judgment, the whispers, the assumptions, it wore me down. It was like carrying a weight that never got lighter. Melissa knew exactly what she was doing. Every few months, like clockwork, I'd get a new photo of Lucy, carefully posed, always with some sad caption, "Lucy misses her daddy," or "Wish you could have seen her dance today." I never replied. I just deleted them. But the pattern never changed. She'd drop the photos, then vanish for a while, only to show up a place she knew I'd be. It felt like a psychological campaign designed to break my resolve. Eventually, I realized this wasn't even about the child anymore. Melissa wasn't looking for support, she was feeding off the drama. It was as if keeping me entangled in this ongoing nightmare gave her some sense of control or satisfaction. It stopped being about Lucy's welfare and became about keeping me tied to her world, a game of emotional chess I never agreed to play, but couldn't escape from either. I reached a point where I even considered moving out of state, a clean break, a fresh start somewhere Melissa wouldn't be able to reach me so easily. But then I thought, why should I be the one to run? Why should I abandon my job, my home, my friends, just to escape a person who refused to face the truth? So I stayed. I endured the stares, the gossip, the awkward silences at gatherings. I waited, hoping that eventually she'd tire herself out. But Melissa wasn't about to get bored. If anything, she grew more inventive. Each time I thought we'd reached the end, she'd show up with some new story, some new emotional plea. "Lucy deserves to know her father," she'd say, as if she hadn't spent years dodging the very test that could make that conversation real. I began to realize this cycle wasn't going to end on its own. Then came a conversation that changed everything. I was catching up with an old friend, Ben. We hadn't spoken in a while, and as we chatted, Melissa's name came up. Ben was one of the few people who had always believed me, who had never bought into her act. So I vented a little, telling him how she always came back the minute a restraining order expired, pushing the same story without ever taking a DNA test. Then got real quiet, then said, "You know, I think she tried the same thing on a guy I know." That stopped me cold. I asked what he meant, and Ben explained how a friend of his, Dave, had dated Melissa briefly. After they broke it off, she showed up a few weeks later claiming she was pregnant and hinting he could be the father. I thought he was joking, but he was dead serious. My brain spun trying to process it. For years I had believed I was the only one, that I was the central character in her tragic tale. But now, I was starting to realize I might not have been her only target. Maybe Lucy wasn't just a weapon she used against me. Maybe she'd used this same narrative on others. So I asked Ben to introduce me to Dave. He agreed without hesitation. Within the hour, we were on a call. Dave walked me through his experience, and it was almost identical. Melissa had pulled the same stunt. claimed she was pregnant, hinted he was the father, refused a paternity test. The only difference was that Dave had cut ties immediately and never looked back. Hearing his story sent my thoughts into overdrive. How many others were there? How many men had Melissa manipulated with this same tactic? Dave and I started comparing notes, retracing her timelines. It was eerie how similar our experiences were. Suddenly, my years of stress and legal battles seemed like just one part of a much larger pattern. That night, after my conversation with Dave, I sat alone in my apartment, thinking about how far this had all gone. What started as a questionable pregnancy claim had evolved into a years-long saga of manipulation, legal battles, and emotional warfare. It had become clear this wasn't just a dispute between exes, it was a pattern, a strategy. Melissa had mastered the art of playing the victim and using that role to rope others into her story. With that realization, something in me shifted. I wasn't just fighting for my own peace anymore. I was determined to make sure no one else fell into the same trap. I started organizing all the documentation I had collected over the years, every message, every restraining order, every witness account. If Melissa tried this with someone else, I wanted to be able to warn them, to give them something solid they could use to protect themselves. It wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about putting an end to a cycle. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a real shot at stopping it. As we kept digging through connections, mutual friends, former coworkers, anyone who had been in Melissa's orbit, we began to uncover a much bigger picture than we had anticipated. The more we reached out, the more stories came flooding in. It turned out that Melissa hadn't just pulled this act with me, Dave, or Steve. She had been orchestrating variations of the same manipulation game with multiple men, each one unknowingly a part of her long con. We discovered 2 more guys who'd been tangled up in her web. One of them, Steve, had actually been giving her financial support for months. He explained that when Melissa first approached him, she framed it as a plea for help. According to her, if he had any decency, he'd support Lucy, whether or not there was absolute proof. Steve said she didn't ask for thousands, just a couple hundred here and there. It was never enough to raise suspicion, but just enough to trigger guilt. He gave in a few times, figuring he'd rather help than feel like a jerk. But every time he brought up the idea of a paternity test, Melissa would get defensive and flip the conversation. She accused him of doubting her integrity, painting herself as a wronged woman who couldn't believe he'd even question her. Now I was sitting in the same room with Ben, Dave, and Stevie, each of us a thread in the same tangled mess, finally seeing the larger pattern. For years, I'd believed Melissa's obsession with me was just a personal vendetta, some twisted byproduct of a bad breakup. But in reality, she had been running this quiet little scam on multiple fronts, using Lucy as emotional leverage to extract sympathy and money from anyone who seemed vulnerable enough to comply. The most surreal part was how casual the others were about it. These guys had just chalked their experiences up to bad luck and moved on. None of them had considered pressing charges, raising alarms, or even talking about it. Melissa had kept everything low-key, emotionally charged but never explosive. She made herself the victim in every story, playing the part so convincingly that no one questioned her. And that's exactly how she got away with it. The more we talked, the more we began to realize that each of us had been holding a piece of a much larger puzzle. Only by comparing notes did the full picture come into view. We sat down and built a timeline, laying out when Melissa had been involved with each of us, how she had introduced Lucy into the narrative, and when the financial requests or emotional manipulations had begun. The timeline painted a chilling portrait, not of a desperate single mother, but of someone who had turned deception into a full-time operation. That's when I decided enough was enough. We couldn't let her keep doing this to us, or to anyone else. I called my lawyer and brought him up to speed. When I walked into his office with a stack of evidence and 3 other men who'd gone through nearly identical experiences, he was visibly stunned. He told us he had never seen a case quite like this before, but he agreed that we had a solid foundation to pursue legal action. Together, we could finally expose what Melissa had been doing. We filed a formal motion, and the court ordered Melissa to appear. That's when everything escalated. She denied everything, of course, stood in court acting like we were a gang of jilted exes trying to ruin her life. But her facade began to crack under the weight of consistency. Our stories matched, our timelines aligned. The court couldn't ignore the sheer volume of corroboration. My lawyer highlighted key moments: how Melissa had repeatedly refused paternity tests, how she had taken money under misleading pretenses, how her narratives changed depending on who she was talking to. Bit by bit, her carefully woven story began to unravel. For the first time, Melissa didn't have control of the conversation. Then came the judge's order, a court-mandated paternity test. I'll never forget the look on her face. It was like watching her house of cards collapse in real time. Her confident demeanor faded, replaced by panic. She argued, insisted it was unnecessary, claimed it was humiliating. But the judge wasn't buying it. He made it clear, no more stalling, no more drama. The truth had to come out. All of us took the test. I remember walking out of that courtroom filled with a strange cocktail of emotions, relief, anger, and something that almost resembled hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would finally be over. For the first time in years, I had the sense that Melissa's grip on our lives was loosening. But what haunted me most was how close she had come to getting away with it. If I hadn't run into Ben and shared my story, we never would have connected the dots. We would have remained isolated, each convinced we were just unlucky, dealing with a manipulative ex in our own private hell. Melissa could have kept this up for who knows how long, playing the same game with new targets, repeating the same lies. It was chilling to realize how refined her tactics had become. She knew exactly how to press people's emotional buttons, how much to ask for, how long to wait before resurfacing, how to play innocent just enough to dodge suspicion. But the most disturbing part wasn't the money or the manipulation. It was Lucy. This little girl, whoever her real father was being used as a pawn in a game she didn't even understand. A child caught in the middle of lies, shame, and guilt she had no part in creating. Melissa had used her daughter not as a person, but as a tool. And that broke something in me. I felt sympathy for Lucy, sadness. She didn't ask for any of this. But, as much as I felt for her, I also knew this wasn't my burden anymore. I wasn't her father, and until Melissa could prove otherwise, I had no obligation. I just wanted my name clear and my peace back. I wanted this whole ordeal to end. For me, for Dave, for Steve, for any other man Melissa had lied to. The day of the final hearing arrived, and it felt unreal walking into that courtroom. After years of gaslighting, of guilt-tripping, of emotional warfare, here we were, 4 men, virtually strangers before this nightmare began, now united by one woman's web of deceit. We had spent months comparing evidence, working with lawyers, building our case, and now we stood together, waiting for the final chapter. When Melissa entered the courtroom, she wore a bright smile, trying to project the image of a misunderstood woman. But her eyes betrayed her. This wasn't confidence, it was desperation disguised as charm. As the judge prepared to begin, I looked around at the others and realized how far we had come. And finally, for the first time in years, I felt like we were going to win. The judge called the courtroom to order, and as the proceedings began, there was no more room for stories or manipulation, only facts. For once, Melissa didn't have the upper hand. All those years of confusion, shame, and frustration were being laid bare, and justice, slow as it had been, was finally catching up. No matter the outcome of the DNA test, the truth was in motion, and that was a victory none of us ever thought we'd see. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as Melissa waltzed in, her head held high, a performative smile plastered on her face. And then, astonishingly, she gave a small wave, like she was walking into a cafe to reconnect with old friends, not entering a courtroom where her web of lies was finally about to be untangled. She even waved at one of the guys she'd emotionally exploited, as if they were all just acquaintances catching up over coffee. It was surreal, but that was Melissa in a nutshell, always performing for her audience, always slipping into the role of misunderstood victim. As the judge entered and the hearing formally began, she immediately launched into her usual monologue. Her voice quivered as she spoke about the hardships of being a single mother, about how she had struggled for years doing the best she could. She cast herself as a martyr, a brave woman holding it all together for the sake of her child, asking only for what was right. I sat in my seat, grinding my teeth, trying not to explode while she spun this tale full of half-truths and omissions. But this time, the judge didn't look convinced. You could read the doubt written all over his face, and that was before my lawyer even stood up. When he did, he laid it all out with chilling precision. He began with my story, outlining how Melissa had first told me I was the father of her baby, how she refused a paternity test, how she repeatedly used the line, "Lucy needs her daddy," to rope me back in every time I tried to walk away. He listed out every message, every uninvited visit, every manipulative tactic she had used to keep me trapped in her chaos. All of it presented with timestamps, screenshots, and legal filings to back it up. It was jarring, hearing years of torment summed up so methodically. A dark chapter of my life reduced to bullet points and evidence. Then he passed the baton to the other men. Dave stood up next, calm but clearly rattled. He recounted how Melissa had done the exact same thing to him, claimed he was the father, refused testing, asked for money, vanished when he pushed for proof. Then Steve spoke, detailing how Melissa had guilted him into giving her money for Lucy, knowing full well there was no confirmed link between them. One by one, each man painted the same picture, each tale almost indistinguishable from the last, the different names, same manipulation. Melissa's attorney scrambled to defend her. He tried suggesting that we couldn't actually prove wrongdoing, that maybe Melissa had genuinely believed each man was the father, maybe it was all just one big misunderstanding. But the judge wasn't buying it. He looked over the stack of statements, the nearly identical timelines, and even he struggled to keep a neutral expression. It was obvious Melissa's legal team had nothing. They were floundering, trying to put a wholesome spin on what had become blatantly predatory behavior. The judge finally turned his attention to Melissa and asked the question we had all been waiting to hear. "Miss Clark, why did you refuse paternity tests from every single man who came forward? Why insist each was the father but never allow any confirmation?" The air went still. Melissa's face turned bright red. She stammered, fumbling for words, her eyes darting around the courtroom like she was searching for a cue line in a script. She finally muttered that she found the idea of testing insulting, that she thought a mother's word should be enough. She tried to shift the narrative again, talking about how hard life was as a single mom, how her only intention was to protect Lucy. But her voice lacked its usual conviction. For the first time, she seemed aware that her story wasn't working. The judge didn't let her off the hook. "Miss Clark," he said, his tone cold and direct, "you've been asked by multiple men to confirm paternity and you've refused every time. I must seriously question the credibility of your claims." It was the beginning of the end. Melissa looked deflated. Her shoulders sagged. Her mouth opened like she wanted to object, to cry out, to restart her well-rehearsed speech, but nothing came, just a weak whisper that she didn't think it was necessary. My lawyer spoke again, hammering in the final nails. He explained how Melissa had knowingly accepted financial support under false pretenses, how she had emotionally manipulated people and isolated Lucy from anyone who might be her actual family. He emphasized the emotional toll, the financial cost, and the years of disruption she had caused. With each word, Melissa seemed to shrink. Then came the final blow. The judge ordered an immediate court-supervised paternity test. Melissa tried one last emotional plea, saying it was demeaning and that she didn't understand why we were doing this to her. Her voice cracked, and the tears came, but they felt hollow now, overused weapons that had lost their edge. The judge didn't waver. He told her that the test wasn't just for our peace of mind. It was for Lucy, that the girl deserved to know the truth, that no child should grow up under a cloud of confusion just because a parent didn't want to face facts. And with that, the session was adjourned. As we got up to leave, Melissa sat frozen in her chair, looking around but avoiding everyone's gaze. She didn't say a word, not to me, not to Dave, not to Steve. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. For the first time in years, the illusion had shattered. No more guilt trips, no more staged run-ins. Just the raw truth laid bare under courtroom light. Walking out of that courthouse felt surreal, like stepping out from under a heavy shadow I hadn't even realized I'd been living in. I wasn't looking over my shoulder anymore. I wasn't replaying every encounter, wondering what manipulation might come next. It was like being released from a cage I hadn't built but had been locked inside for far too long. The other guys and I gathered outside the building. There were no cheers, no back-patting, just quiet nods, a few handshakes, and the unspoken understanding that something monumental had just ended. We had walked through fire together, and now we stood in the clear, singed but not broken. We didn't need to say much. The weight of what we'd gone through had bonded us more than words could. For the first time, Melissa wasn't in control of the narrative. For the first time, we had taken that power back. In the days that followed, I started feeling something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The constant dread, the uncertainty, the guilt that had been carefully sewn into every interaction with Melissa was finally unraveling. It would take time to fully process everything, but I finally had clarity, and with it, the strength to move forward. Whatever happened with the test, one thing was certain: her story was no longer the only one being heard, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like my life truly belonged to me again. The moment we had all been waiting for had finally arrived. After years of emotional whiplash, manipulation, and a steady stream of lies, we stood on the edge of finally learning the truth. The courtroom sessions had done their job. Melissa's elaborate story had collapsed under the weight of evidence. Now, there was only one thing left: the paternity results. It felt like the final chapter of a book that had gone on for far too long. No more guessing, no more dancing around the issue, just the facts. We had all dispersed from the courthouse with a strange calm, not quite victory but definitely relief. Everyone went their own way, knowing that soon we'd have the final answer. In those days that followed, the anxiety crept in. Even though I had always been certain I wasn't Lucy's father, there was still that tiny, irrational voice in the back of my mind kept whispering, "What if you're wrong?" I tried to shake it, but the weight was maddening. I was at work when the call came through. My lawyer's name flashed on my phone screen and my heart leapt into my throat. I stepped out into the hallway, pacing with the phone pressed tight to my ear. My coworkers passed by, probably wondering if I was losing it. Finally, I asked the question that had haunted me for years. So, am I the father? His answer was swift and clear. No, I wasn't the father. I stood there for a second, stunned, and then it hit me like a wave, relief, so deep and overwhelming I had to lean against the wall. I had known it, deep down, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. It was like stepping out of a nightmare I didn't realize I'd been living in for so long. The invisible chains of guilt and confusion shattered in that moment. Of course, anger was there too, anger at Melissa for everything she'd put me through, the years wasted, the friendships strained, the constant cloud of judgment I lived under. But stronger than the anger was the sense of closure. I had done everything I could to prove the truth, and now that truth was undeniable. I sent a group message to the other guys who had been dragged through the same ordeal. It's official, we're all clear. It didn't take long for our phones to start buzzing. Soon enough, we were all on a group call. Dave, Steve, Ben, and a couple of others, each one of us reacting with the same blend of relief, disbelief, and exhaustion. There was no cheering, no wild celebration, just quiet voices, the occasional chuckle, and a lot of long sighs. We had made it through, barely, but we had. And just when we thought it was over, Melissa proved once again that she wasn't done. The very next day, she showed up at my house, screaming, crying, making a scene so loud that half the neighborhood must have heard her. She stood in my front yard, shouting that I had ruined Lucy's life, that I had turned people against her, that I was a coward for hiding behind a legal system. Her voice cracked as she threw accusation after accusation, none of it making sense, all of it driven by rage and desperation. I didn't go outside. I didn't say a word. I stood by my window and watched, calm and detached, like someone observing a storm from behind glass. She was unraveling. There was nothing left for her to use, nothing to threaten me with. Eventually the police arrived, called by one of the neighbors. Melissa had violated the restraining order again, and this time it wasn't a warning. They arrested her right there on the lawn. And for a moment, I felt victorious but vindicated. But then came the part I didn't expect. A few days later, my lawyer reached out again. He had a letter from someone named Rose Melissa, great-grandmother. She apologized, said she had been kept in the dark about everything, that she had genuinely believed Melissa's stories. For years, she had supported Melissa financially, thinking she was helping a struggling young mother. Now, knowing the truth, she had cut off that support and taken Lucy into her care. That news hit me in a different way. I didn't know much about Rose, but I knew that getting Lucy away from Melissa was probably the best outcome that could have happened. And then my lawyer mentioned something else. Rose had sent a letter. From Lucy. At first, I wasn't sure I wanted to read it. What could a child possibly say in the middle of all this? But I did. I sat down, took a deep breath, and opened the envelope. It started simply, "To the man I thought was my dad." That line alone nearly knocked the wind out of me. She wrote about how, for as long as she could remember, her mom had told her I was her father, that I didn't want to see her, that I didn't care, that I was too busy with my own life to make time for her. She said she used to wait by the window, wondering if I'd ever show up, and every time she asked Melissa why I wasn't around, she was told it was because I didn't love her. Reading those words made me want to throw the letter across the room. Not out of anger at Lucy, never that, but because of the lies she had been fed, because of the damage those lies must have done to a young girl trying to make sense of the world. She wrote about feeling confused, betrayed, like her whole childhood had been a story someone else made up. And then, near the end, she apologized. "I'm sorry for what my mom put you through. I'm sorry I believed you." That was the hardest part. A child, just a victim in all of this, apologizing to me for something that was never her fault. I sat with that letter for a long time, thinking, feeling, wondering if there was anything I could do to make up for the years we had both lost. But in the end, I knew it wasn't my place. Lucy had family now, people who cared about her and could give her the stability she needed. What she didn't need was another person forcing himself into her life. So I wrote back, a simple letter. I told her I wasn't angry with her, that none of this was her fault, and that I wished her nothing but peace and happiness in whatever path she chose. I told her that if she ever wanted to talk again, on her terms, I'd be there. I mailed it and let it go. And for the first time in years, I truly felt free. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The silence that followed was a kind I hadn't experienced in years. Peaceful, undisturbed, and entirely mine. No more unexpected messages, no more staged photos, no more drama waiting just around the corner. The The echoes of Melissa's chaos were finally fading, and what remained was something I had almost forgotten how to enjoy. My own life. And maybe, just maybe, that was the justice we all deserved. I knew I couldn't step in and fix things for Lucy. This was Melissa's mess, one that she'd crafted over years of deceit. But I hoped, truly hoped, that Rose would be able to help Lucy unpack everything she'd learned. The truth had finally come out, but the damage it had caused would take time to heal. And Melissa, well, the fallout for her was nothing short of catastrophic. With her own family, and especially Rose, finally recognizing the full scope of her manipulation, Melissa's entire support system crumbled beneath her. Rose had been the one financing her lifestyle for years, thinking she was aiding a struggling single mother abandoned by a heartless man. Once she learned the truth, Rose didn't just stop the financial support. I don't think Melissa saw that coming. Without that safety net, she was alone for the first time in a long time. And while a small part of me felt a sliver of pity for her, the rest of me was just relieved. Finally, she couldn't drag anyone else into her toxic world. Finally, she was facing real consequences, not just in court but in her personal life. Her credibility was gone, her story exposed, and the people she'd deceived had turned away. Maybe now she'd think twice before weaving another web of lies. Maybe. As for me, for the first time in over a decade, I felt peace. The nightmare was over. I had spent years questioning myself, wondering if I'd missed something, if maybe, just maybe, there was a chance Lucy was mine and I'd failed her. But now I knew. I had clarity, I had truth, and with that I could finally move forward. This whole ordeal had taught me more than I ever wanted to learn. About people, about trust, and about the extraordinary lengths some will go to maintain their lies. I came out of it with a few scars, sure, but also with a strange kind of closure. I'd done everything I could to protect myself, to act with integrity, and when Lucy reached out with her own truth, I didn't shy away. I helped where I could, and I walked away when it was time. And I thought that was it, that the story was over. But life, as it turns out, isn't always done when you think it is. Roughly a month after the dust had settled, I got a message. This time from Lucy herself. It wasn't angry, it wasn't dramatic. She simply wanted to talk, and for once, it wasn't about me. It wasn't about Melissa. It was about finding the man who actually was her father. She'd been processing everything since the court case, she said. The lies, the manipulations, the betrayal. And now that she knew the truth about me, she was ready to find the man who was truly her dad. To my surprise, she asked if I could help her. At first, I was hesitant. I worried that getting involved again might stir up more drama, especially since Melissa had a way of resurfacing whenever she sensed attention shifting away from her. But this wasn't Melissa. This was Lucy, mature, calm, and sincerely searching for answers. She wasn't trying to stir the pot. She just wanted to know who she really was. So, I agreed. We started the search modestly. Lucy had a few belongings of her mom's old letters, boxes of photographs, and a few mementos that Melissa had never bothered to throw away. Some of it was junk, but some of it might hold clues. Together, we went through everything, matching dates, sorting timelines, piecing together fragments of conversations Lucy remembered from childhood. Melissa had never talked about her past much, but Lucy had picked up on small details here and there. A name mentioned in passing, a photo tucked in a drawer, a postcard from a trip Lucy never remembered taking. One image stood out, a worn Polaroid of Melissa on a beach, her arm around a guy we didn't recognize. He looked to be in his early 20s, shirtless, laughing, clearly relaxed in her presence. There was no writing on the back, no date, nothing to help us identify him. Just Melissa and this mystery man looking for all the world like a couple on vacation. Lucy remembered something then. A vague comment Melissa had made once about a boyfriend she dated just before everything changed. She had never elaborated, and Lucy hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now it felt like a thread we needed to follow. We turned to social media, some of it, ancient by today's standards, digging through pages that hadn't been updated in over a decade. Eventually, after more hours of clicking and squinting at blurry profile photos than I care to admit, we found him. His name was Alex, and even though his profile was dusty and long abandoned, it was enough to get a message to him. Lucy hesitated before sending it. I could see the nerves on her face, the cautious hope. What if he doesn't respond, she asked. What if he wants nothing to do with me? I told her the truth, that it was possible, but that she deserved to know no matter what the outcome. To our surprise, Alex responded a couple of days later. He was shocked, confused, but open to talking. Lucy asked me to come with her when they met, said she didn't want to do it alone. I wasn't sure I had a place in it, but I agreed. If being there made her feel safe, then it was the least I could do. When we met Alex, the resemblance between him and Lucy was uncanny. They both had the same laugh, the same way of tilting their heads when they were thinking. Alex listened carefully as Lucy told her story, from the years of lies to the court battle to the search that brought her here. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, just listened, and when she finished, he said quietly, "Let's find out the truth." He agreed to a DNA test. The wait was painful. Lucy tried to keep busy, but I could see the tension on her face every time we spoke. She was afraid that this might be another disappointment, that maybe she'd never know where she came from. But then the results came in. Alex was her father. I was there when she opened the envelope. Her hands trembled as she read the words. Then, she let out a breath like she'd been holding it for years, her eyes filled with tears, not sadness but relief. Gratitude, joy. After all the chaos, all the confusion, she finally had a concrete truth to stand on. Alex was stunned too, but he didn't hesitate. He told her he wanted to be there for her, wanted to get to know her, to make up for the time they'd lost. Slowly but surely, they started building a relationship. Dinners, weekend visits, long phone calls to catch up on the past 20 years. I stepped back. This was their time, their journey. And while I wasn't part of it, not really, it still gave me closure. Of course, news got back to Melissa eventually. As expected, she didn't take it well. She claimed the DNA results were rigged, accused me of brainwashing Lucy, accused Alex of stealing her daughter, but for once, no one was listening. Her own family shut her down. Even people who used to believe her had seen the truth with their own eyes. Melissa's grip had finally broken. And me? I'm finally at peace. Helping Lucy find her real father wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the final piece of my own healing. It let me close the door on a chapter of my life that had hung open for far too long. Lucy got her answers, and I got mine. We don't talk often anymore, and that's okay. She has a new life now, one filled with clarity and honest connections. I know she's in good hands. And, for the first time in years, I'm not looking over my shoulder. I'm not waiting for the next call, the next accusation, the next guilt trip.